Baby girl found a German shepherd barking at a suitcase. What she saw inside melted hearts. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a moment in time that will stay with you forever. A moment that tested the strength of a child, the loyalty of a dog, and the fragile line between tragedy and triumph. This isn't fiction. It happened. And it might just change the way you see the world. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This story deserves to be heard. It was the kind of morning that small American towns are known for. The sun had just begun to climb above the rooftops, spilling golden light over neat white fences and flower beds carefully tended by hands that had known many seasons. Church bells rang softly in the distance, their echoes carrying through the quiet streets. The scent of warm bread drifted from the corner bakery, mingling with the crisp air of a day that promised peace and predictability. It was the sort of morning that felt safe, like nothing could possibly go wrong. In the front yard of a modest farmhouse, a little girl in a blue dress chased butterflies through the tall grass. Her laughter was silent but her joy unmistakable. The way her tiny shoes pressed into the earth, the way her curls caught the sunlight. She was no more than 3 years old, her innocence painted across every movement. To her, the world was still a place of wonder, where each flutter of wings or rustle of leaves carried the promise of adventure. And then it happened. A sharp, urgent bark shattered the calm. It wasn't the kind of bark that echoed in play, nor the friendly call of a neighborhood dog. This was different, fast, desperate, commanding. The little girl froze, her wide eyes searching for the sound. From beyond the wooden fence at the edge of the property, a German shepherd appeared, its powerful frame silhouetted against the sunlight. Its coat was damp with morning dew, its sides heaving as though it had been running for miles. The dog's voice rose again, loud, insistent, filled with something more than panic. Each bark carried a message, as if pleading for someone, anyone, to follow. The little girl tilted her head, confusion flickering across her face. She had seen dogs before, but never one like this. This animal's eyes burned with urgency, its tail wagged faintly, not in play, but in a trembling rhythm of hope and fear. With the curiosity only a child could possess, she stepped closer. Tiny feet crunched over gravel as she approached the fence. The shepherd paced in front of her, barking, then darting back toward something hidden behind the tall grass. It would run a few steps, then stop and glance back, waiting for her to follow. Her small hands gripped the wooden slats of the fence as she peered beyond. And that's when she saw it. An old suitcase. It lay half buried in mud and weeds, its edges frayed, the once bright leather dulled by years of neglect. The metal latches were rusted, one corner dented, as though it had been tossed aside and forgotten. Yet here it was, and the German shepherd's cries grew louder with every second she stared at it. The dog's body trembled, not from fear of her, but from the urgency of what was locked inside that battered case. The little girl's innocent gaze flicked between the shepherd and the suitcase. She didn't understand why a dog would guard such a thing. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear and wonder as she slowly stepped through the gate, drawn by something she couldn't explain. The shepherd lowered its head, eyes never leaving hers, as if begging her to see, truly see, what lay hidden within. And in that moment, the calm of the morning shattered into suspense. For inside that suitcase was something that would test the strength of loyalty, the power of innocence, and the unbreakable bond between a child and a dog. What could possibly be inside a suitcase that made even a loyal German shepherd cry out for help? The German shepherd did not back away. His ears were pricked forward, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths, but his eyes held no malice. This was no wild beast snarling at intruders. This was a guardian. His thick coat, though muddy and damp from the storm, glistened faintly under the pale morning sun. He stood tall, his gaze flicking between the little girl in the blue dress and the battered suitcase that lay half hidden in the weeds. The child, barely 3 years old, tilted her head, curls bouncing as she studied him. She wasn't afraid. Innocence has a strange power. Where adults see danger, children often see a friend. She took a cautious step forward, her tiny shoes sinking into the soft ground. The dog gave another sharp bark, his voice echoing like a warning bell across the quiet street. Yet, even as his voice rang out, his tail lowered, wagging with a hesitant rhythm that spoke more of pleading than threat. The little girl crouched slightly, as if to make herself smaller, and whispered in her soft, almost musical tone, "It's okay, boy, it's okay." Her words were quiet, but they cut through the shepherd's frantic rhythm like a gentle melody. For the briefest of moments, his barking slowed, his ears twitching at the sound of her voice. She extended her small hand, palm open, fingers trembling with both curiosity and trust. The shepherd leaned forward, sniffing the air between them. His nose twitched, and a low whine escaped his throat, something between desperation and relief. Then, as if remembering the urgency of his task, he spun back toward the suitcase. His paws splashed through the shallow puddles forming in the grass, circling the suitcase in frantic loops. Every time thunder rolled in the distance, his voice rose louder, more frantic, as though warning the skies themselves that time was running out. The little girl's brow furrowed. She didn't understand why the dog was so distressed, but she felt it, like a vibration in the air, a heaviness in her chest that made her want to help. She toddled closer, her eyes wide, her hand outstretched toward the suitcase. The German shepherd paused beside it, panting hard, his eyes flicking from the girl to the case and back again. He barked once, sharply, then nudged the suitcase with his nose. It shifted slightly in the mud, heavy, reluctant to move. Rust clung to the hinges, the leather torn and waterlogged. The little girl crouched beside it, her small fingers brushing away dirt. Her innocent voice rose again, this time directed at the battered case. "Shoo, it's okay. Don't be scared." From the kitchen window of the farmhouse, Jack Harper watched the scene unfold. At 68 years old, his bones had grown slower, but his instincts, honed from years as a veterinarian, were sharp as ever. He had grown used to the silence of his granddaughter, to her quiet play in the yard after the tragedy that had stolen her mother away. But now his heart skipped a beat. She was talking to a dog. Jack's hands froze on the dish towel. His eyes narrowed as he caught sight of the shepherd, circling something near the fence. Alarm surged through him. He pushed through the screen door and hurried down the porch steps, calling out in a voice that cracked with both authority and fear. "Emma, sweetheart, step back." The little girl turned, her curls plastered slightly to her forehead by the rising dampness in the air. She didn't move away, but her eyes, bright and urgent, pleaded with him silently. Jack's boots sank into the wet earth as he approached, his pulse quickening when he saw the source of the dog's frantic alarm. The suitcase lay in the mud, locked tight, its sides bulging ever so slightly as if something inside pressed against them. The shepherd barked again, circling Jack now as if urging him to act. Jack knelt by the suitcase, his fingers brushing the cold, rusted metal of the latches. His stomach tightened. Whatever was inside, it was alive. He could hear it now, faint and muffled, a whimper, a tiny, desperate cry almost lost beneath the growl of distant thunder. "Dear God," Jack breathed, fumbling at the lock. His hands, though skilled in gentler tasks, shook with urgency. He tugged at the latches, pulled hard at the lock, but it refused to budge. The suitcase had been sealed tightly, perhaps intentionally. His jaw tightened. Someone had done this on purpose. Emma stood close, her small hand resting on the shepherd's back for reassurance. The dog stayed perfectly still beneath her touch, though his body trembled, his eyes never leaving Jack's hands. Every time the thunder rolled, he barked louder, pushing at the case with his nose, pawing at the mud as though to dig it free. Jack pulled harder, straining against the lock. The metal groaned but held firm. He cursed under his breath, his heart pounding with the knowledge that time was slipping away. He rocked back on his heels, frustration etched deep into the lines of his weathered face. "It's locked tight," he muttered. "We'll need tools." Emma tugged at his sleeve, her eyes brimming with unspoken urgency. She pointed at the suitcase, then at her chest, her way of saying she felt what was inside. Jack understood. She had always had that sensitivity, that uncanny way of sensing an animal's pain. It was what her mother had loved most about her. "I know, sweetheart," he said gently, brushing a strand of wet hair from her forehead. "We'll get them out. I promise." But even as he said it, the suitcase gave a faint shudder. The cries inside grew weaker, more desperate. Jack's chest tightened. He looked at Emma, at the German shepherd whose voice had become hoarse from barking, and he knew they couldn't afford to wait. He gripped the suitcase handle, yanking with all the strength his aging body could muster. Mud sucked at its base, holding it down, but with a final wrench it came free, heavy in his arms. He staggered back, nearly losing his balance. The shepherd pressed close, whining, pawing, desperate for him to continue. Jack dropped to his knees again, his breath ragged. He pulled at the lock until his palms stung, until the metal dug cruelly into his skin. But it held fast. He pressed his forehead against the suitcase for a moment, eyes closing as the storm crackled overhead. Behind him, Emma's small voice broke the silence once more. Soft, fragile, but clear enough to pierce through the thunder. "Please, help them." The shepherd barked again, as if echoing her plea. And Jack realized with a cold, sinking certainty, this was no ordinary discovery. This was a test of loyalty, of compassion, and of time itself. Something, or someone, had locked away life inside this battered case. And unless they found a way to break it open, that life would slip away before their very eyes. The storm rumbled closer. The cries grew weaker. The suitcase remained sealed. And the tension thickened, heavy as the clouds gathering above. The storm rolled heavier above them now, each rumble shaking the ground as if the skies themselves shared the urgency of the moment. Jack's hands were raw from pulling at the rusted lock, his breaths uneven, his face lined with worry. The suitcase seemed determined to keep its secret buried. But Jack Harper was a man who had spent his life saving lives that others might have given up on. He had mended broken wings, stitched torn paws, and cradled fragile creatures in his hands until they found strength again. He would not let this suitcase defeat him. The German shepherd circled tighter, pawing at the earth, barking with a voice so desperate it seemed to tear from the deepest part of his chest. His eyes glistened, pleading, demanding that Jack continue. Emma stood beside him, her tiny hand clutching the shepherd's fur for courage. Her wide eyes never left the suitcase. Her small lips trembled, and when she finally whispered "please" again, the word carried a weight far beyond her years. Jack clenched his jaw and made a decision. He grabbed a heavy rock from the ground, its surface jagged and wet. With both hands, he struck the lock. The first hit only dented the rusted metal, but it was enough to jolt the shepherd into a frenzy of barking. Jack hit it again. The second strike echoed louder than the thunder. He raised the rock once more, his muscles screaming with effort, and brought it down with everything he had. The lock gave way. The sound was sharp, final, a cry of surrender from the old suitcase. Jack dropped the rock and pulled the latches apart with shaking hands. For a moment, the world seemed to still. The rain slowed, the air hushed, as though even nature itself was holding its breath for what would be revealed. Jack lifted the lid. The The sight inside knocked the breath from his lungs. Nestled in the damp lining of the suitcase were tiny, trembling forms. Puppies. 5, maybe 6 of them, their fur matted, their eyes still closed to the world. They whimpered weakly, their cries faint, fragile, like the sound of hope clinging to life by the thinnest thread. Their small bodies were pressed together for warmth, but the suitcase had been no cradle, only a prison. Jack's vision blurred as tears welled in his eyes. He had seen cruelty in his career, but never something so deliberate, so merciless. These tiny creatures had been locked away, abandoned to a fate they could never escape on their own. Before Jack could react, the German shepherd lunged forward, not with aggression, but with devotion. He thrust his head into the suitcase, his tongue sweeping gently over each puppy, nudging them, warming them, counting them in his own way. His body trembled, not with fear, but with relief. He had known. He had known all along. Emma gasped, her small hands flying to her mouth. For a moment she was silent, her eyes wide and brimming with awe. Then, with a voice fragile but filled with wonder, she whispered a single word. "Puppies." The sound of it was soft, but it carried like a bell through the storm, a melody of innocence that cut through the darkness. Jack froze, his head snapping toward her. It wasn't just what she had said, it was that she had spoken at all. After months of silence, after countless days where her voice had been locked away by grief, the sight of these fragile creatures had pulled a word from her lips. His chest tightened, tears burning hot in his eyes. He placed a trembling hand on her shoulder, his voice breaking. "Yes, sweetheart, puppies." Emma dropped to her knees in the mud, her blue dress soaking without a thought. Her small fingers reached into the suitcase, trembling but gentle, brushing against the tiny, damp bodies. One puppy squeaked at her touch, wriggling weakly, and Emma giggled, a sound Jack hadn't heard in what felt like a lifetime. It was the laugh of a child rediscovering joy. The shepherd's eyes softened as he watched her. He pressed closer, his nose brushing Emma's arm as if to say, "You see now. You understand why I called you." Jack swallowed hard, his voice low, filled with reverence. "Sometimes," he whispered, more to himself than anyone, "a dog's heart knows what human eyes cannot see." He carefully lifted one of the puppies into his calloused hands. It was no heavier than a loaf of bread, its tiny chest rising and falling so faintly it made Jack's stomach twist with fear. "We need to get them inside, Emma," he said gently. "They won't last long out here." Emma nodded fiercely, her little arms already scooping another puppy with all the seriousness her tiny frame could muster. The shepherd hovered protectively, whining, nudging Jack and Emma toward the house as though hurting them. The rain began to pour again, heavy drops soaking their hair and clothes, but neither Jack nor Emma noticed. Their focus was only on the fragile lives in their arms. Jack hurried toward the farmhouse, Emma stumbling after him with determined steps. The shepherd pressed so close against them it was as though he were carrying the weight of the moment himself. Inside the warm glow of the kitchen, Jack laid the puppies on soft towels pulled hastily from the cupboard. Emma knelt beside them, her fingers stroking their tiny backs, whispering, "Shoo, shoo, you're safe now," in a voice so tender it melted Jack's heart. The shepherd pushed his nose against each puppy, licking away the dampness, his eyes never leaving Emma's. Jack watched, the scene searing itself into his heart. A mute child speaking again, puppies clinging to life, a loyal dog proving that love often speaks louder than words. Jack's hands trembled as he wrapped another puppy in a towel. "Who could do this?" he muttered, his voice cracking with both anger and disbelief. But then he looked at Emma, her cheeks flushed, her smile small but real, and he realized the question wasn't important right now. What mattered was saving them. The shepherd settled at Emma's side, finally resting, his body pressed close, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. But even in rest, he remained watchful, his gaze fixed on the fragile forms he had fought so hard to protect. And as Jack knelt beside them, his granddaughter's soft whispers filling the room, he felt a truth settle deep into his soul. They had not just saved the puppies that morning. The puppies, in some miraculous way, had saved Emma too. The storm had finally begun to quiet outside, but inside the farmhouse the atmosphere was anything but calm. Jack's kitchen, usually filled only with the scent of strong coffee and the ticking of an old wall clock, now glowed with urgency and fragile hope. On the counter lay the puppies they had pulled from the battered suitcase, tiny lives bundled together on soft towels. Their whimpers rose like faint cries from another world, each sound a plea to be held, to be warmed, to be saved. Jack hovered above them, his hands trembling despite a lifetime of steady work as a veterinarian. The little girl sat close, her knees folded beneath her blue dress, her eyes wide with wonder and worry. Her tiny fingers brushed gently over the damp fur of one pup as if she had been entrusted with something sacred. The German shepherd rested beside her, his eyes heavy but unyielding, every muscle in his body still alert as though he believed his duty was not yet complete. For a brief moment, Jack considered fetching one of the heavier quilts from the living room, something thick enough to keep out the chill. But before he could rise, Emma stood up on her small legs and padded toward her bedroom. Jack called after her softly, but she did not answer. Minutes later, she reappeared, dragging something clutched tightly in her hands. It was her baby blanket, worn and faded, the one she had never allowed far from her side since her mother's passing. Jack's breath caught in his chest. That blanket was her comfort, her protection against the silence of long nights and the grief she had carried. Now, without hesitation, she knelt down and spread it carefully over the puppies. Her small hands smoothed the edges as if tucking them in for sleep, whispering softly, "Warm." Jack had to turn his face away for a moment, his eyes clouding with tears. That blanket was more than fabric. It was her heart. To see her offer it to these fragile lives was to see a child's compassion bloom in its purest form. The puppies stirred beneath the soft cloth, their cries fading into faint sighs as they nuzzled deeper into the warmth she had given them. The shepherd lowered his head, licking Emma's hand once as if to thank her for what he could not say. The sudden knock at the door startled them all. Another followed, firmer this time, and then came voices calling from the porch. Jack's pulse quickened. In small towns, news traveled faster than rainwater down the gutters. The shepherd's barking earlier must have carried through the neighborhood, and now curious neighbors were arriving to see what had happened. Jack opened the door, and a cluster of townsfolk stood there, wrapped in coats and umbrellas, faces anxious in the gray light of the storm. Mrs. Thompson from the bakery gasped the moment she saw the scene inside. "Jack Harper," she exclaimed, pressing her hand to her chest. "What in heaven's name are those puppies?" Jack stepped back and gestured them in. His voice was grave, heavy with the truth he could hardly believe himself. "Found them in a suitcase. Left out in the rain to die." The words dropped like stones in water. Shock rippled through the room. A young man muttered angrily about the cruelty of people. Another woman wiped at her eyes and whispered, "How could anyone be so heartless?" They crowded nearer, their expressions shifting from disbelief to grief to something stronger, resolve. Emma pulled the blanket tighter around the puppies, her little arms spread as though shielding them from the crowd. The shepherd rose to his feet and stood guard, his body stiff but not aggressive, simply protective. His presence demanded respect, and the room seemed to quiet at the sight of him. Jack laid a hand gently on the dog's back. "Easy boy. They're friends." Mrs. Thompson shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "Bless him," she whispered. "He knew. He must have known what was inside all along." Jack nodded solemnly. "He never stopped until we listened." The people fell silent, watching the shepherd with something like reverence. In his loyalty and persistence, they saw a truth that went deeper than words. It was the kind of truth that reminded them of their own humanity. But compassion alone would not heal starving bodies. Jack hurried to the phone and dialed the number he knew by heart. Within minutes he had explained everything to Dr. Miller, the town veterinarian, and his old friend. "Don't move them too much," Miller instructed. "I'll be there right away." When the vet arrived, drenched from the rain but calm as ever, the room hushed again. With hands worn but gentle, he lifted each puppy in turn, examining them carefully. His murmurs, "underweight, dehydrated, still fighting," fell like verdicts, heavy but edged with hope. Finally, he straightened and met the eyes of those gathered. "They're weak, but alive. Thanks to him." He nodded toward the shepherd, who sank back onto the floor with a weary sigh. If not for that dog, they wouldn't have made it through the night. Emma stroked the shepherd's head softly, whispering, "Good boy." His tail thumped once against the floor, his eyes closing in brief peace. Dr. Miller wasted no time. He pulled out bottles of formula and showed Jack and the neighbors how to feed the newborns with careful patience. Soon the kitchen was filled with an extraordinary sight: hard-working men and women holding tiny creatures in their rough hands, cradling them as though they were the most precious things in the world. Their voices softened, their faces melted, and for a moment everyone became caretakers of something fragile and sacred. "This town's seen its share of cruelty," Mr. Harris, the postman, said in a low voice. "I still remember the horses left tied in the blizzard, or those kittens someone tossed in the river last year. But this," he shook his head, his eyes shining with anger and grief, "this is darker than all of that." Mrs. Thompson's jaw tightened. "And it's something we won't stand for anymore. Not here. Not ever again." Murmurs of agreement swept through the room. In that farmhouse kitchen, shock and sorrow were transforming into something else: resolve. These people, bound together by tragedy and compassion, would not let such cruelty pass unanswered. Jack looked around the room and felt his chest swell with both pain and pride. His granddaughter sat with her baby blanket wrapped around the smallest puppy, her eyes glowing with a light he had feared lost forever. The shepherd lay close, his gaze fixed on her, the bond between child and dog unspoken but undeniable. And around them, neighbors who had once been bound only by proximity now shared something deeper: the responsibility of care, the burden of compassion, and the promise of protection. Outside, the storm still rumbled faintly in the distance, but within those walls there was warmth, there was life, and there was hope. The farmhouse echoed with tiny breaths, soft whimpers, and the voices of a community rediscovering its heart. For the first time in a long time, Jack Harper felt something stir deep in his chest, a belief that maybe, just maybe, love was still stronger than cruelty. The farmhouse settled into a rhythm after the storm, a rhythm built not on routine chores or quiet evenings, but on the fragile sound of tiny breaths and the steady heartbeat of hope. The basket of puppies, once discovered in darkness and despair, now rested in the corner of the living room, cushioned with soft towels and Emma's treasured blue blanket. The glow of the fireplace painted the room in warm light, flickering across the faces of those who kept watch. But no one kept watch as faithfully as Emma. Each night, after Jack had urged her to sleep in her bed, Emma would find her way back to the basket. She would curl up on the rug, her small body pressed close, her tiny hands reaching inside to stroke the soft fur of whichever pup stirred. She did not care about the hour or the cold floor beneath her. Her heart seemed tethered to them, as though some invisible string bound her to their survival. Jack, waking in the night to check on her, would often find her already fast asleep beside the basket, her cheek resting against the shepherd's broad side. The German shepherd had become her shadow. Once a stray who wandered town streets, He now claimed his place as her guardian. His golden eyes followed her wherever she went, his ears pricked at every sound near her. If she moved toward the door, he rose with her. If she laughed, his tail wagged in perfect time. And when she sank into sleep beside the puppies, he settled next to her, his massive head resting gently across her lap as if to say, "She is mine to protect, and I will not leave her." Jack would pause in the doorway, his breath catching at the sight. It was a picture so tender, so filled with trust, that words failed him. A small child who had carried the silence of grief for months, now whispering lullabies to newborn lives. A stray dog, hardened by the unknown roads he had walked, finding rest only when his head lay in the lap of a little girl. These were not coincidences. They were bonds being written in the language of love, pure, unspoken, eternal. One night, Jack brought in an extra quilt, tucking it around Emma as she lay curled on the rug. She stirred only slightly, her small hand reaching out in her sleep to pull the blanket tighter around the puppies instead of herself. Jack's throat tightened. Even in her dreams, her first thought was for them. The shepherd lifted his eyes to Jack as if to share the same thought. She is giving them the comfort she once needed herself. Jack knelt and stroked the shepherd's fur. "You're both saving her," he whispered, "and she's saving you too." Days passed, and with them came small miracles. The puppies, once too weak to lift their heads, began to grow stronger. Their cries were louder, their movements bolder. Each morning Emma would rise before anyone else, rushing to the basket to count them, her little lips whispering their names. Names she had begun to give, names only she used, but which the shepherd seemed to recognize. "This one is Daisy," she would tell him, holding up a tiny female with the softest whimper. "And this one was." The dog would sniff each one solemnly, tail swishing with approval as if acknowledging her choices. The bond between Emma and the shepherd grew deeper with each sunrise. He followed her to the garden when she picked wildflowers, waited by the porch when she wandered after butterflies, and pressed close whenever thunder rolled again. At night, when shadows made the house groan and sigh, he stayed beside her bed until she drifted off, only moving once he was certain she was safe. And when she inevitably returned to the basket of puppies, he went too, reclaiming his place as her silent sentinel. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the air filled with the scent of rain-damp earth, Emma performed a ritual all her own. She lifted her baby blanket, now worn from constant use, and spread it once again across the basket. Then, with the seriousness of a mother tucking in her children, she leaned down and kissed each tiny head in turn. The shepherd, as though understanding, lowered his head onto her lap, his warm breath rising and falling against her dress. Together, girl and dog sat in stillness, guardians of fragile life, their bond weaving threads of innocence and loyalty into something eternal. Jack watched from the doorway, his heart so full it ached. He thought of the older folks in town, the way they often spoke of times when loyalty was simpler, when a man's word and a dog's devotion were worth more than gold. Watching Emma and the shepherd, he understood why such stories lived forever in people's hearts. Loyalty was not a tale of the past, it was alive before his very eyes. The image of a child sharing her most cherished blanket and a dog resting his head in quiet trust was proof enough. The puppies grew stronger with each day that passed. Their eyes began to flutter open, revealing worlds of wonder they had not yet seen. They stumbled on clumsy legs, tumbling into Emma's arms as though she were the center of their universe. Their tiny tails wagged when her laughter filled the room, and the shepherd stood taller, prouder, as though these small lives were now part of a legacy he had vowed to protect. The farmhouse, once silent with sorrow, had become a sanctuary of life. Each corner echoed with small sounds, paws scuffling, puppy whimpers, Emma's delighted giggles. And through it all, the shepherd's steady presence anchored everything. He had once barked to the heavens for help, desperate to be heard. Now he had found not only help but family, a place where his cries had turned into companionship and his loneliness into belonging. For Jack, it was as though God himself had answered prayers he had not dared to speak aloud. The girl who had been swallowed by silence now whispered names, lullabies, and secrets to the puppies. The dog who had once stood alone now shared his strength with her. And the fragile lives that had been locked away in a suitcase now carried the promise of healing, not just for themselves but for everyone who loved them. On a quiet evening, as fireflies began to dance beyond the porch, Jack sat with a cup of coffee, his gaze fixed on the scene inside. Emma lay curled beside the basket, puppies nestled close under her baby blanket. The shepherd's head rested in her lap, his eyes half closed, ears twitching only when the wind shifted. Jack whispered into the fading light, "This is what loyalty looks like. This is what innocence can heal." And as the night settled around the farmhouse, a peace deeper than words filled every corner of the home. The morning after the storm, the little town shook off its damp coat of worry and got to work. Word traveled as it always did, carried on bakery gossip and porch steps, wrapped into paper cups of coffee at the hardware store, blossoming into purpose by noon. Dr. Whitaker, the town's soft-spoken veterinarian with sleeves forever rolled and spectacles forever smudged, pulled his old Suburban into Jack's gravel drive. Behind him came Mr. Donnelly from the feed store, two high schoolers with phones ready for pictures and apologies ready for being there, and Mrs. Carter from the bakery with a box of day-old cinnamon knots nobody could refuse. They weren't just curious. They had the look of people who felt a tug in the chest and knew they owed something back. The suitcase, mud-caked, dented at one corner, its brass clasp bent like a bad memory, sat beneath the oak as if it had grown from the roots overnight. Dr. Whitaker crouched beside it, tracing the grime with a gloved thumb. "That's roadside mud," he murmured, half to himself. "Not from the farm. See the grit? Sand mix, like the county shoulder by Briar Creek." He looked up at the ring of faces. "Who found it first?" "The shepherd," Jack answered, nodding toward the dog. The big German shepherd stood a few feet away, one ear tilted to the basket inside, the other tuned to the world. He no longer barked. He watched. He listened. He guarded. Emma, clinging to the edge of Jack's flannel shirt, peeked around his side and then let go, toddling on determined feet toward the vet. She set her small hand on the battered lid, then pointed to the fence where it had been discovered. The gesture was so clear, so earnest, that Mr. Donnelly felt his eyes sting. "She's showing you the path," he said gruffly. "Lord help us for not seeing it sooner." They retraced steps the way a memory retraces grief, slowly, stopping where the ground seemed to hold a story. Near the fence, deep paw prints flooded and softened by storm water, circling, circling, circling. Along the ditch, the scrape of suitcase wheels where someone had dragged before they'd given up and thrown. And farther down the lane, where the church bell could just be heard between gusts of wind, Dr. Whitaker found it, two parallel tire patterns veering close to the culvert. "Old pickup," he said, kneeling to eye the tread. "Balding on the inside. Wobbly right rear." He scraped a fingertip through a small glittering smear and wiped it against a white handkerchief. "Grease. Road grit. Somebody backed in here quick." They drove the shoulder slowly, hazard lights pulsing like a heartbeat, until Mrs. Carter pointed. "There." A strip of weeds flattened toward the water, and scattered among the reeds, 3 zip ties and a length of twine. Mr. Donnelly lifted a sun-warped fragment of cardboard, its edge printed with the faded logo of a discount store 2 towns over. The high schoolers photographed everything, the way the suitcase skid marks overlapped the shoe prints, the torn twine, the greasy smear of where a hand had pushed. It wasn't quite a crime scene, but the hush felt like church. Back at the farm, Dr. Whitaker scanned the shepherd for a chip. The reader beeped, then faltered, then gave a garbled string, like a name whispered through a broken window. "Not standard," he said, frowning. "Might be an old breeder's chip, scratched or tampered with." He ran careful hands along the dog's ribs and shoulders, eyes going distant at the feel of an old healed line near the ear. "He's known kennels," the vet said softly. "And why?" "And worry." The shepherd blinked up at him, then shifted to press his side against Emma's legs. She giggled, and for a moment the room breathed out. By late afternoon, gossip had matured into testimony. A delivery driver swore he'd seen a white pickup with a dented tailgate parked near Briar Creek at dusk the night before the storm. A retiree who listened to the scanner said there'd been whispers this spring about a backyard breeder out near the county line. Litters too frequent, females too thin, buyers too anonymous. And a teacher remembered a flyer from animal control. "Dumping animals is a crime. Call this number." She found it on her fridge under a magnet shaped like a green apple and brought it by, cheeks flushed with urgency. The sheriff came without sirens, took notes without judgment, and left with evidence in brown paper. "We'll run the tread pattern, the store receipt if you find one, and the camera feeds along Route 8, he said, tipping his hat to Emma. "But what you've done already, this," he gestured to the living room where the basket pulsed with tiny breaths. "This is the difference between a tragedy and a miracle." As the story knit itself tighter, a picture formed so clear it hurt to look at. A litter born to a dog who'd been bred too many times, born in the shadow of a storm to people who counted dollars more carefully than heartbeats. A suitcase, chosen for convenience and silence. A roadside, chosen for distance. A ditch, chosen for forgetting. And somewhere in that geography of cruelty, the shepherd broke free. Perhaps he watched the taillights and followed until the road split. Perhaps rain washed his scent, and he lost and found it again and again. Perhaps he searched for days, belly empty, paws raw, driven by a need no hunger could drown. He found the ditch. He found the suitcase. He found the fence. And when the world would not listen, he barked at the sky until a small blue dress came running. The town felt the ache of it like a splinter under the nail, tiny but impossible to ignore. There was talk, yes, but more than talk. The church opened its hall and rolled out heat lamps. The feed store posted a notice: donations for the pups, blankets, formula, patience. The high schoolers started a page to coordinate fosters and rides. Mrs. Carter put a sign in her window: "Buy a knot, help a pup," and promised every dollar from cinnamon knots would go toward vet bills. And when Dr. Whitaker tallied the first receipts that night, he found a folded paper with no name and 8 crumpled 20s. On the back, "For the ones who can't ask." A neighbor. Guilt came too, honest and heavy. "We should have known," Mr. Donnelly said, staring at the suitcase as if it accused him. "We see a stray and we think, someone else will handle it." The baker nodded. "We hush the kids when they ask why. We say, that's the way of things. But it's not. It shouldn't be." Dr. Whitaker removed his glasses and cleaned them though no smudge remained. "Guilt's only good if it changes us," he said gently. "Let's let it change us." That evening, the community gathered on Jack's lawn. Folding chairs sprouted like mushrooms after rain. Children clustered near the basket, parents hovering, seniors claiming the shade. The sheriff spoke briefly about the investigation. The pastor offered a prayer that was mostly a promise. And then Jack, flannel sleeves rolled, voice thinner than he liked, stepped forward. Emma stood beside him in her blue dress, one hand tangled in the shepherd's collar. "We talk about small towns like they're fragile," Jack said, eyes sweeping the faces he had known for decades. "But I think they're just close enough for hearts to knock into each other." Mine knocked into hers. He looked at Emma, and hers knocked into his. He rested a hand on the shepherd's head. "And we're going to keep knocking until every door that should open does." He didn't plan to say more. But Mrs. Carter, flour still dusting her sleeve, lifted her chin and called what everyone had been tasting all day. "If a child can save lives with her innocence, why can't we?" The words landed and took root. A murmur of agreement rose, then a ripple of applause, and then the kind of quiet in which intentions set like concrete. Sign-up sheets passed from hand to hand. Fostering, transport, night watches at the church hall, a rotating list of bottle feeders for the dawn hours when even hope gets sleepy. Someone suggested a town ordinance with teeth, stricter licensing, mandatory inspections, penalties that actually stung. Another promised to pay for microchips for every adopted pup so no one vanished into the anonymous dark again. Emma didn't understand policy. She understood warmth. She understood that when she tucked her baby blanket over the basket, people smiled like sunrise. She understood the shepherd, whom she had started calling Captain, because he always led her to safety, would not move from her side even when the crowd pressed close. He wore a red bandana someone had tied around his neck, and he accepted pats with regal patience, but his eyes always came back to her, as if counting. 1, 2, 3. When the sun dipped and the cicadas began their violins, Jack carried the suitcase to the porch and set it, cleaned and mended, by the steps. A handwritten sign leaned against it, not for leaving, for beginning. People laughed softly and tucked envelopes and notes inside. A boy dropped in a drawing of a German shepherd with a cape. A woman slid in a poem. The sheriff placed a card with his cell on it and a single sentence: "Call before it becomes a suitcase." Before the crowd dispersed, the pastor asked for one more moment. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't preach. He just looked at Emma, then at Captain, then at the basket breathing like a tiny tide. "We are measured by how we hold the smallest lives," he said. Today, a child held them first. Let that be our instruction. Heads bowed, not because they were told, but because something inside wanted to learn. That night, the town went to sleep differently. Doors were locked, yes, but eyes were open all the way to the soul. The high schoolers set alerts on their phones to check the overnight cameras along Route 8. The sheriff's cruiser paused longer at the creek. The bakery mixed extra dough. And at the farmhouse, Emma fell asleep leaning against Captain, her baby blanket draped over a future she had not meant to carry but had carried anyway. In the hush between her breaths, the town made a promise big enough to carry them all. To answer barking with action, to meet guilt with goodness, to make it impossible for cruelty to hide. By morning, the cinnamon nut box was empty and the suitcase-turned donation chest was full. The puppies stirred, stronger than yesterday, hungry for the next hour. Captain lifted his head at the first sparrow and looked toward the road as if to say, "We will watch now. All of us. Together." And the town, changed by a child's small courage, found that watching, with love ready to move, was exactly what hope required. By the next week, the yard sounded like a tiny parade. The puppies, once quiet as fallen leaves, tumbled across the grass with bellies round and legs too big for their plans. They wrestled in soft piles, slid over the sun-warmed boards of the porch, and skittered wherever dandelion seeds drifted. Captain, the German shepherd who had once barked the sky awake, now lay stretched along the steps like a sentry at peace, ears swiveling lazily, eyes half-lidded with trust. If a car door popped down the street, he lifted his head. If Emma laughed, he was on his feet in a heartbeat, that low, happy woof in his chest that felt like a promise kept. Emma had a new way of walking, less cautious, more bounce. If fear had been a shadow stitched to her heels, the morning sun had finally unpicked it. She toddled toward the oak without clutching Jack's sleeve, then turned to wave him over as if the tree belonged to them both. When thunder murmured somewhere beyond the hills, she reached, not for the windowsill this time, But for Captain's rough, burying her fingers in the thick fur and tipping her small face against him. "Saw Kai," she told the weather with a solemn nod that made Jack smile through the ache. Captain leaned into her, eyes soft as if he, too, believed her declaration carried weight with the clouds. Neighbors arrived daily, as reliable as the bakery's first batch. The high schoolers, sheepish about the phone videos they'd taken that first day, built a proper puppy pen from scrap fence and borrowed pride. Mr. Donnelly replaced the broken hinge on the barn, then pretended not to notice when Emma handed him a plastic teacup during his water break. Mrs. Carter came with warm cloths and cooler heads, doling out cinnamon knots to anyone who forgot to eat and scolding anyone who tried to pay. "You'll insult the dough," she said, thumping a box onto the porch rail. Dr. Whitaker kept a chart tacked to the wall. Weights, worming, tiny milestones written like prayers. Each evening the pastor's wife read a picture book on the steps while the puppies drifted off in a patchwork pile, and even the teenagers leaned closer than they meant to. Inside, the battered suitcase that once held their fear had a new job. Jack had cleaned it until the brass blinked again, then lined it with gingham. It became the beginnings box, filled with adoption blankets, the quilting circle stitched between gossip and gospel. One pale blue, one butter yellow, one the exact green of the feed store sign. Folks tucked notes into the folded corners. For a brave start, for rainy days, for the dog who teaches you your best self. Every time Jack closed the lid, he felt something settle in his chest, as if the town had agreed to carry the weight that once crushed a litter. Captain's trust grew in quiet increments, like rings inside a tree you don't see until years later. He began taking treats from Jack's palm without the flinch of a dog counting fingers. He learned the kitchen's promise: no brooms raised, only cabinets that sighed, and the living room's mercy, a rug soft as pasture. He slept hard enough now to dream. Paws twitching, a muffled huff, a tail that thumped once as if greeting someone who visited him behind his eyes. On the third evening after the storm, the wind shouldered in with rain and he stood in the doorway, measuring the light, measuring the sound, then turned back into the house of his own accord. The choice broke something open in Jack. He had to sit, unexpectedly, and let the room steady around the gratitude. Emma's courage took the shape of generosity. She had a blue rabbit, frayed ear, flat bow, that had been her nighttime anchor since lullabies were steady as clocks. She carried it everywhere, face down in the crook of her arm, guarded in sleep like a secret. That afternoon, she toddled to Captain, rabbit tucked under her chin, and held it up so he could sniff committee style. He nudged it cautiously, then rested his chin on the floor and waited. She set the rabbit between his paws and patted his nose. "Yours," she said, a gift so total that Jack's throat tightened. Captain looked at her, at the rabbit, then picked it up with careful teeth and trotted to the basket where the puppies slept. He lay the toy at the rim like a flag, then returned to the bowl, grabbed a mouthful of kibble and, one crunch at a time, spilled a small pile near the smallest pup, nudging the pieces forward with his nose. Emma clapped. Jack covered his face briefly because, what else do you do when kindness halts you mid-breath? Sometimes the smallest hands carry the heaviest kindness. The town found its rhythm around those small exchanges. The high schoolers drew a chalk calendar on the barn wall. Bottle Brigade, 5 a.m. Playpen Patrol, 3 p.m. Bath night, bring towels you don't love. Someone pinned up a Polaroid of Emma asleep on the porch swing, Captain a comma at her feet, puppies a spilled sentence in the shade. Under it, a caption, Grammar of Grace. Mr. Donnelly, who swore he didn't write nothing but checks, left limericks on the feed sacks. The pastor's wife pretended not to laugh and then laughed anyway. A retired nurse came by with a stethoscope and a history of holding ends and beginnings the same way. In two hands, steady as faith. With strength came mischief. The pups discovered shoes, specifically laces which, to them, must have seemed like purpose-built spaghetti. They learned the crackling joy of leaves and the philosophical disappointment of chasing your own tail. They practiced their voices, each bark a different note in a choir that only rehearsed at dinner time. Captain corrected politely, a soft growl that said mind your mothers, and when they listened, he rewarded them with a lick that sent them toppling. Emma toddled after the noisiest, palms out like a conductor, laughing when the whole chorus turned toward her. "Hush," she whispered, half play, half miracle, and they did, just long enough for a picture that would sit on Jack's mantel long after the house needed repainting. Jack watched the muscles return along Captain's shoulders, watched Emma's cheeks pin-ken with sun and unafraid air, watched the way people lingered in his yard even after their tasks were done. They traded recipes and phone numbers and stories they hadn't told in years. A widower found himself staying late to sweep the porch because the sweeping sounded like conversation. A teenager who'd been bad at showing up for anything did not miss a single bottle brigade shift. "Turns out I'm punctual for puppies," he joked, but the pride in his voice didn't duck behind the laugh. The greater good had a roster now, and it looked like his neighbors' names in blue ink. On a Wednesday trimmed with gold light, Dr. Whitaker pronounced the litter clear as bells. He tapped a chart with a knuckle and squinted through his smudged spectacles. "Weights are up, bellies are down, ears are pretending to be wings, excellent signs." He paused and looked at Captain. "And you, sir," he said, scratching behind the healed ear, "are a credit to love's curriculum." Captain closed his eyes, long lashes resting against the tired place he no longer carried alone. The vet slipped microchips under warm skin, murmuring the names the town had bestowed like benedictions. Clover, Scout, Button, June, and the small one Captain always fed first, the blue-ribboned pup Emma called Sprout. When the first adoption applications trickled in, they did not feel like endings. They felt like pages turning with careful hands. Families came to sit on the porch and let a puppy choose them the way rain chooses its own path down a pane of glass. The beginnings box gave up blankets and notes. Mrs. Carter tucked cinnamon knots into paper bags, for the road, for the heart. Emma helped by holding leashes with both fists, serious as a bell, and telling each pup bye-bye 3 times so the goodbye would stick gently. Captain stood beside her, tail slow, eyes steady. He seemed to understand that love's geometry allows expansion without subtraction, that sending a piece forward doesn't make home any smaller. That night, after Sprout fell asleep with his own piece of the blue rabbit between his paws, Jack carried Emma to bed. She curled on her side, the leftover corner of the rabbit tucked against her chin. Rain played far away on the horizon like a drummer on break. The house settled. Captain stretched out in the doorway of her room, paws crossed, on guard at ease. Jack stood a moment in the hall, an old man in a good ache, and let the sight teach him what it came to teach. He thought of thunder and kitchens and the weight of a child's toy in a dog's careful mouth. He thought of how a town had learned to show up, and how showing up had changed the weather inside them. Downstairs, the suitcase turned beginnings box clicked softly as it cooled in the evening air. Tomorrow there would be more bottles to wash, more paws to dry, more neighbors at the fence with stories folded into their palms. For now, the house breathed in time with the small lives it held. Jack switched off the porch light and left the door cracked for Captain, then whispered into a room that felt like a kept promise. "Sleep, little ones." In the hush that followed, he realized the town had built something sturdier than any fence or ordinance. They had built a habit of tenderness. And tenderness, when practiced daily, becomes the kind of courage even storms remember to respect. The story of a battered suitcase on a quiet town's edge will never be forgotten. Cruelty had left its mark there, yes, but it was outshone by a child's innocence and a dog's loyalty. What was meant to be an ending became a beginning, because one baby girl in a blue dress chose curiosity over fear, and one German shepherd chose love over despair. Together, they saved not just the whimpering lives inside that suitcase, but also awakened something dormant in the hearts of their neighbors. Innocence, we are reminded, is not weakness. Sometimes it is the purest form of strength. A child who cannot lift a suitcase can still lift an entire community with a single act of compassion. A dog who cannot speak our language can still teach us everything about loyalty. And when those two forces, innocence and devotion, stand side by side, even the darkest cruelty trembles before them. The town will carry this lesson forward, that loyalty never fades, that love hides in unexpected places, and that the smallest hands can indeed carry the heaviest kindness. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who still believes in kindness that never fades. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story, too.